Our speaker is uniquely qualified to offer a laser-sharp perspective on both the state of the American political system and the zeitgeist of the U.S. electorate. He's been working in broadcast journalism since the age of 18, first at local television stations in Arizona and California, and since 1995 at NBC News. He's held a variety of key posts at the network as a correspondent covering some of the biggest news stories of the decade, as an occasional anchor of the NBC Nightly News, and even as a backup host for the Today Show. But it was his posting as NBC's chief White House correspondent during the presidency of George W. Bush that cemented the speaker's top-tier status within Washington's media and political circles. His rigorous questioning of administration policy earned him the reputation of being perhaps the toughest member of the White House press corps. 2 years ago, just as the Bush administration was ending and the Obama era beginning, our guest was named to one of the most prestigious seats in broadcasting, moderator of Meet the Press, a show that hit the airwaves 63 years ago this month. He succeeded Tim Russert, who had hosted the show for a record 16.5 years. A native of Los Angeles, he's a fellow graduate of American University in Washington, D.C. Now, today's appearance is a little bit of a homecoming for our speaker. Starting in 1996, he spent part of a year in NBC's Chicago bureau, during which time he says he has two very vivid memories. The first was his inaugural visit to Wrigley Field, and the second was the day he purchased his first ever polar parka. I did not ask if those events occurred on the same day. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to welcome a leading observer of the nation's political landscape and the moderator of America's longest-running television program, Mr. David Gregory.
I still remember that parka. I mean, it stands up on its own in the garage because it's just so huge. It's like a spacesuit, honestly. Well, thank you all for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, David, for that introduction. Thanks for all the sponsors here this morning. It is nice to be back in Chicago. I've got very fond memories having been here, although I never got to spend enough time here. I was off covering the subsequent Simpson trials and then the Oklahoma City bombing trials, where I met my wife Beth, who was prosecuting the McVeigh trial and then the Nichols trial. So I wasn't in Chicago a lot when I was in Chicago, but I've certainly got fond memories being back. You know, this is really a fascinating time. I was in a bar last night, only because I wanted to see the Redskins lose so horribly to Philadelphia, and I stayed up to see if they could get to 70 points, if the Eagles could actually score 70 points to beat the Redskins. But a guy walks up to me and he says, "You know, thanks for doing Meet the Press." And I thought, wow, you know, he's thanking me. This is such an incredible job that I have, and I am still so excited about having it. It'll be 2 years coming up in December, and it means so much for me to be able to do it, because the platform is, I think, so important to the country, and it's much bigger than me or any host who's in the chair. But I'm also really committed to what Meet the Press is about, which I describe as a complete, credible, and I hope compelling conversation. We live in an age of polarized media, for sure, and I'm hopeful that Meet the Press can remain sort of above that fray and be a place where we really do have a constructive dialogue. And there's just so much, as I go around the country, there's so much desire for that, with people both anxious and confused and angry about what's happening in Washington. So as a place for accountability and as a place for that kind of dialogue, I feel very strongly about it. You know, the transition that I had to go through was certainly not easy. It was stressful at times, but I thought throughout, you know, I want to try to measure up for this audience. I can't beat Tim Russert, nobody can, but I can try to take the program in a new direction in a way that would be consistent with what he would expect and what the audience expects from the program, and I'm trying to do that each and every Sunday. I want to go through a few areas with you this morning. The timing is terrific after the midterm election. I'll give you a few election takeaways, talk a little bit about the politics of the economy, the president's leadership, and then the 2012 landscape. Of course, the 2012 race actually began a couple of weeks ago in earnest, so we are headlong into it. But I want to give you a sense of how the atmospherics have changed in Washington. You know, a couple of years ago, President Obama is elected. He's the president-elect, and the city is abuzz. I mean, I think a lot of the country was. You think about the Grant Park speech and how much anticipation, how much expectation there was. And it filtered down to the youngest of children, and even my own. We were invited very graciously by the Bushes to see a children's film at the White House. And as I have 3 kids, I have 5-year-old twins and I have an 8-year-old. And so we go, we see the film. It was Despereaux, and they were all very excited and happy to be at the White House. And afterward, the Bushes came down and they gave out cookies to the kids. And so my 8-year-old had met President Bush before, so he was kind of, you know, he'd been there and done that. But my 5-year-old... My 5-year-old was very excited, and he meets the president, and he says, Daddy, Daddy, I met the president, I met the president. You know, I put my hand out, and he put his hand out, and we shook hands, and I met the president. I said, sweetheart, this is fantastic. What a banner day this is. And so we're walking away. We're about 5 feet away from the president, and he says, was that Barack Obama? So the expectations were high. Now, I can't let it go just because Bush is back in the news, too. I'd be remiss if I didn't tell my favorite Bush story as well. Now that his memoir is out and he's, you know, he's back speaking around the country. I'll never forget being in Paris with him before the Iraq War, his first visit with Chirac, with whom he got along so well. And I remember, there were all the, you know, we'd been in Germany, and there were all these protests were beginning in the run-up to the Iraq War. And so I stood up at a press conference and I said, essentially, Mr. President, why do so many people hate you here? And then I said to Chirac in French, because I had studied in Paris, I said, in French, I asked him, you know, would you comment on this as well? And President Bush, I think at that point, had thought that I committed a war crime, because he took off his headphones. Gregory, what are you doing? Guy memorizes 4 words in French, and he plays like he's intercontinental. You know, of course, I'm on television, so I'm a little self-absorbed. So I'm thinking, oh, wait a minute, what if an international audience doesn't really think I speak French? So I had to calibrate. So I said, you know, Mr. President, I could go on. And he said, oh, really? I'm impressed. Que bueno. Now I'm bilingual. And you can imagine with that warm relationship between Bush and Chirac building ever more, Chirac kind of looks over to him with a look that just says, this is not funny. I don't like you. More. Chirac kind of looks over to him with a look that just says, this is not funny. I don't like you. So this became something of an international incident. I remember I had to call Russert the next morning from Italy and just say, Tim, we have a problem here. He said, doesn't Chirac speak English? And I said, well, yeah, but I mean, you know, I was all caught up in the moment there in the Élysée Palace. So we get back to Washington, and Bush can't stop talking about it. He has Tom Daschle in there in the Roosevelt room, a cabinet room, and he said, yeah, that's the guy who spoke French to me. Leader of Poland comes to town, and he looks at, you speak Polish? He said, no, Gregory here speaks French. So you fast forward, we go back, we're back in Europe in 2004, and we were in Italy early in the day, and after a press conference, Bush singles me out. I mean, we're in the middle of the war on terror in Iraq and the whole thing. He said, hey, Gregory, you better brush up on your French. I might call on you later. I'm thinking, don't you have anything better to do? And so we get, and then we're in Chirac's private office later, and he's there with Chirac, and he said, you know, Mr. President, I brought back my French-speaking reporter. And Chirac is kind of looking at it, this is not funny. I don't like you. we get to the press conference, and because, you know, my colleagues, you all have colleagues like this, they're so supportive. They say, you know, David, you really should ask another question in French. Because, and you know this is true of your coworkers, they were looking after my best interests, which I think is really good. And so, so I don't ask a question in French. I actually asked a tough question of Chirac about Iraq and so forth, and he claimed not to understand the translation. And afterward, Bush comes up to me, and Chirac is next to me. He said, hey, Gregory, where was the French? And I said, you know, Mr. President, my wife told me I got enough mileage out of that the last time around. And Chirac is still looking at him. This is not fun. So, anyway, that's Bush, and there were good times, and it's certainly a consequential time. Let me get to a few top-line thoughts here before I take your questions. First, a couple of key election takeaways. I think the obvious point is that Americans voted their economic anxiety. I don't think we have to overanalyze that because we know where unemployment is. We know the full depth of this housing crisis, which I don't frankly think is talked about enough, not in the media and certainly not in the political class, because it's a huge driver, I think, of unemployment and still fundamentally an unsolved problem because there is no mortgage market, secondary market in the country, which is a huge issue. But I think it really was also a rebuke in some ways of President Obama's vision of what government can and should be doing in a period of political and economic upheaval. And I think that's very important because Rahm Emanuel, who I think is doing something in town, I'm not exactly sure what, you know, but he famously said, you know, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste here in Washington. And I really do think there was a mentality as they came in the middle of a financial crisis to say this is sort of an FDR moment here. This is a big liberal moment in that there's a lot that government can and should be doing. Stimulus being an obvious place to go. Some continuity with regard to bailouts for the banks and for the auto companies. All started, of course, under George W. Bush. But what you saw was, first of all, a decision to say publicly that with the stimulus plan, unemployment would be kept at 8%, which was, I think most people will agree, a monumental political and strategic error when that did not come to pass. But I do think there was an argument that had been started, which was that government on these circumstances is part of the solution, it's not part of the problem. And I do think the country said, no, that's not how we see it. That's not how we see it, and became increasingly uncomfortable with the role of government. You know, I go back to 2001 and the 9/11 attacks, and what happened post 9/11? President Bush and the Bush administration ushered in a ferocious response in the name of national security, in the name of preventing another terror attack. And that goes on all the way through the 2004 election. No weapons of mass destruction, didn't matter. It was still a referendum on who's going to keep you safe because there was a real threat out there. There continues to be that threat. It takes until 2006 when the country says, slow down. We're going a little too fast in the wrong direction. And that's indeed what sweeps President Obama into office. But then what happens in 2010? There's another hands-up sort of moment saying, slow down. I think we're going a little too fast in the wrong direction. There's no great love affair with Republicans or their ideas. It was simply an idea of moving the government a little too much, a little too fast in a way that Americans think, this just isn't working here. I think even as we continue to follow the health care debate, from a political matter, from a strategic matter, and a policy matter, I think a lot of people are going to conclude that health care reform was the president's war of choice and not war of necessity. Because it came at a time when a lot of Americans are looking up and saying, let me get this straight. So we're changing our lives in terms of what we're spending, but Washington is not doing that. Washington sees fit to create a brand new entitlement and spend a great deal of money. A final point on election takeaway, and I think this is important. People were voting their pessimism right now, and this is really, I think, a key issue. You know, I talk about the housing issue again. For most Americans, as so many of you know, the primary source of their savings, their nest egg, is their house, is the equity in their home. And if that's been wiped away, there is a recognition that it's not coming back. I mean, that source of saving is not coming out. We have not even bottomed out in terms of housing prices yet. So I think people have seen a fundamental shift in the economy to be replaced with what we don't exactly know, but it doesn't give people a degree of optimism. And so the biggest driver we know of the independent voter in America And they're still out there, by the way, for all the talk on the left and the right, taking over everything. The independent voter still really matters. It was that voting bloc that said, gosh, we don't like the trajectory of the country, the direction the country's going. We're really worried about it. We need some kind of restraining order. We need some sort of check on this. And I think that's what the vote really said. What about the politics of the economy right now? I wouldn't presume to tell this group about what the major drivers of the economy are. But the politics are really rather interesting. If there's a mandate for Republicans, it's government spending. A Republican I spoke to last week said a cultural litmus test for the Republican Party will be this earmark issue. The cutting back on the pet projects for individual members in the budget process. And now you saw Senator McConnell switch his position. If you want the nearest example of the Tea Party's influence, it's right there. Because they want to get rid of earmarks, and now they had Leader McConnell, who was not for it, come around and say, yeah, we'll go ahead and do that. The president has already expressed his interest in doing the same. So essentially no skin off his back, so he'll go ahead and do that. So I think government spending is going to be the big proving ground. And I'll come back to that in just a minute, but I do want to get back to housing in just a moment. This, again, is this huge elephant in the room, and nobody's really doing anything about it. In 2008, it was really fashionable, especially for Republicans, to beat up on Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the housing giants that are now part of the U.S. government, and they guarantee 95% of the mortgage debt in this country, $10 trillion worth of debt. Now, what politicians don't tell you is that in the middle of this huge debt situation, we got $13 trillion worth of debt, the U.S. taxpayer is guaranteeing $10 trillion of additional mortgage debt because there's nobody out there who's really buying that debt. The banks don't want to buy all of these mortgages anymore because of the subprime mess and all the rest. And nobody has a real plan, a politically courageous plan for what they're going to do with these big government agencies that guarantee all of this debt. And remember why this matters. So if I'm a factory worker in Michigan and I've lost my job, and I think, okay, well, I'm a 50-some-odd-year-old guy. What am I going to do? I probably want to get reskilled, go get another job somewhere. Maybe I can move. But I can't move because all my equity is tied into my house. And now my mortgage is underwater, and I can't sell my home. I am really stuck. And again, I think that really goes to this measure of pessimism that we're seeing in the country. The debt issue is huge, right? It's what we're going to be talking about in Washington, I think, all of next year in the budget issue. And so the Debt Commission has come out with a pretty draconian plan about if you want to be serious about dealing with the debt, then take this on. And the response was pretty interesting. On the left, it was pretty ferocious. Nancy Pelosi saying it was simply unacceptable. Even on the right, a little bit more comfort with some of the ideas, but concern as well that the Tea Party influence will lead the Republican Party to cut pretty drastically into entitlement spending. This is a moment, right? This is a big moment that will test both the president and Republican leaders. The president, I think, has a vested interest in accomplishing something in this area. Republicans do as well. I think as strong as they were unified in opposition, I think they need to demonstrate that they can get some things done in Washington and find some areas of agreement. And this Debt Commission will be a big proving ground. But it's also going to be tough because I look back and I say the last 22 months, there's nothing but a poisonous relationship between the president and Republican leaders. How are they going to find some common ground on some of the most difficult things you can possibly do in government, which is take on entitlement spending or take on the defense budget or maybe try to roll back the prescription drug benefit under Medicare? And these are tough things. These are going to require a lot of political courage. Is there even a basis for that kind of negotiation? The politics of the economy, a word about tax cuts. I think this will be very interesting. David Axelrod was out last week saying you got to deal with the world the way you see it. By the time he was on my program, he would barely admit that his name was David Axelrod. So I think he wanted to pull back a little bit and not negotiate for the president. The bottom line is I think the president will do two things. I think he'll want to separate the middle-class tax cuts, try to get those through first, and then deal with the upper earners. I think they're going to have to deal at some point and do a temporary extension for the upper earners. But I think what you'll see the president do is argue it this way. Hey guys, you Republicans, you want to be fiscally conservative? Well, where are your corresponding spending cuts to pay for a continuation of tax policy that heretofore did nothing but increase the deficit? And by the way, didn't have a huge impact on creating jobs. That allows him to position himself as more of a fiscal conservative and perhaps as a down payment on wooing back that independent voter that's really left the president. So let me talk to you for a couple minutes about the president's leadership. I think this is a fascinating question. You know, President Obama is an enigmatic figure as a leader. I think part of his problem right now is that there's a lot of Americans who simply don't get him. This is not just a Washington issue. This is not just a media creation. It's not just the lament of Republicans and Democrats in Washington. I think there's a lot of Americans who say, you know, where is this guy coming from? What does he really stand for? I think it goes back to one of the most successful aspects of his campaign, which is, you know, what kind of Democrat was Barack Obama exactly? Was he the pragmatist? Was he a liberal? What was he? The reality is he was all things to all people. He's who you wanted him to be. A lot of Americans, particularly Democrats, projected onto him what they saw in him. You know, for some, he was this mythic, messianic figure who was going to change the culture of Washington by just arriving. He was an historic figure as the first African-American president. He was a liberal who was against the war in Iraq. He certainly wasn't out there talking about health care as you know, the driving force of his campaign. And he's somebody who was certainly going to break up how Washington was done. But for others, he was a more pragmatic leader who was really going to find common ground, who was going to be a little bit more dealing with the business community. You think about some of the people he surrounded himself with. You think about the measure of confidence that Americans had in him to deal with the economy as they found it, which really decided the election. And now I think the president faces a challenge where he's most inspirational when it's about him, but not when it's about you. And that, I think, is his fundamental challenge. I mean, for the president 2 years after his historic election to stand in front of the American people as he did and admit that he's struggling to find a way to connect with the American people, I think is a striking statement. It's a striking statement that he's lost that ability to connect on issues that Americans are struggling with, which is their livelihood, it's their future, it's their anxiety, it's their fear, and it's their real antipathy toward government. And I think this is a big piece that he has to manage. It's not just whether government is part of the problem or the solution. It's the fact that so many Americans, including his voters, his core voter in 2008, the surge voters they're called, not minority voters, younger voters, first-time voters, thought, hey, this was a guy who was really going to be different. You know, this is a group of people who have lost faith in government. They've lost faith in other big institutions, Wall Street, you know, the banks, the media, you know, Lord knows. You know, we're dealing with that lack of trust in big institutions. And yet the president goes in, and one of his signature achievements is the stimulus plan that looked a lot like Washington as usual, and then it was the health care bill, an historic achievement to be sure, but also came at the price of doing business the way Washington does business. It turned a lot of people off. So I'm going to be very interested to see where the president goes, and I'm struck by this. I've asked people, how does he respond? I mean, there's a Clinton model out there from 1994. Is that his response? There's a Bush model out there from 2006, which was a different point in his presidency, where he acknowledged that it was a thumping, but then proceeded to surge up forces in Iraq, which nobody wanted at the time. Which way does Barack Obama go? I've asked people in the White House. The response I get back is, we don't know. We don't know. I think it's very interesting. I think one of the key things that any, you know, political animal does as President of the United States is that they have a way to confound their critics. And I don't think President Obama has found the way to really trip up his critics yet and trip up his political opposition. Republican after Republican I talk to say, you know what? He made it so easy for us to keep saying no in the first 22 months. He's got to make it harder for them to say no. He's got to make the politics so difficult for Republicans that they can't say no. That, I think, is the big test of his leadership in the next year. And by the way, it's not even a year. I mean, it's not going to be that long because the election is coming. And this window, I think, is so small in order to get something done before everybody is sort of off running, in his case, for re-election, or Republicans running for election. So lastly, let me spend a couple minutes talking about that election 2012 landscape. If there is a note of optimism for the president, it's that the only order in the Republican Party is disorder at the moment. And we have to remember, whatever problems that are facing the president, first of all, there's time. The economy can turn itself around to some degree in a way that would certainly be helpful to the president. I think in some ways this mid-course correction is the best thing that is happening for him politically. And starting off here, coming off the blocks, there is no Republican who has a real advantage in the 2012 race. It's not like years past where you say, well, who's the obvious person? Who's lining up? Whose turn is it? You know, because in years past you'd say, all right, well, so Mitt Romney should be the guy. John McCain was the guy. Bob Dole was the guy. George W. Bush emerged as a guy on the Republican side who everybody was going to line up behind. Now we don't know. We really don't know, because we don't know what the impact and the strength of the Tea Party is. What we know about the Tea Party is that they're not on a third-party mission statement. That appears certain. What they are, I talk to Tea Party leaders all the time who say, look, we're just trying to rehabilitate the Republican Party. They want to make the Republican Party more conservative. They want to reduce the size and the scope of government. This is no longer George W. Bush's Republican Party. It is going in a different direction. So the problem is they had some notable hits and some notable misses. So they've got to figure out, you know, what they are, where they have the most influence, and whether, you know, Sarah Palin is their standard bearer. Now, I used to believe that Sarah Palin was never going to run for president. I've changed my view, and it's not just because she's saying even the most recently, well, listen, if nobody else runs, I'll run. Not exactly a profile in courage or ambition in there for the presidency. But she's a completely unconventional force, and she's a juggernaut on the Republican side. I mean, an absolute juggernaut. I mean, she's not only fueling, I think, the grassroots, some of the major ideas and values of the Republican Party, and yet I don't think she's taking some of the more serious steps structurally to put herself in a position to run. But she's certainly putting herself in a position to make life very difficult for Mitt Romney, a Tim Pawlenty, a Haley Barbour, as they try to figure out which way is up, how to appeal to the activists in the party who are going to, you know, help you win Iowa. So she can have quite a role. So you have a big field and a lot of decisions that the Republican Party has to make in the next year about their direction. And I think that one Republican said to me last week, you know, the Tea Party influence, all the fiscal conservatism, in some ways could become a suicide mission for a lot of these Republicans who want to take some steps in terms of, you know, cutting the budget that will ultimately hurt them in a big way politically going into 2012. So we just don't know where they stand, but it's going to be one of the most compelling stories in Washington, and I look forward to covering it. So thanks very much for having me again this morning, and let's take your questions.
Outstanding. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Crane's political reporter, Greg Hines, to lead the questioning of David Gregory. You all know Greg as the weekly columnist in Crane's Chicago Business and as a daily blogger on Crane's website, chicagobusiness.com. But also during the mayoral election season, you will see Greg weekly every Friday on Crane's video news program, Chicago Business Today. A final reminder, if you do have any last-minute questions, to raise your hand and someone will pick them up. I now hand things over to Greg to lead the questioning of David Gregory.
I just want to say one thing. You know, one of the things that I learned from Bush, you know, is how you can answer questions or not answer questions. And I remember it was a press conference, and I was pressing him on an issue of the treatment of detainees, and I said, you know, but Mr. President, you know, this is really important. This is a very important point. And he said, Gregory, I'm the President of the United States. I'll tell you what's important. Go ahead.
Fair enough. Before I get to your all questions, I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and ask one of my own. Barack Obama, being from Chicago, we tend to feel a little parochial about him. Even Pat Brady over there, the state Republican chairman, I'm sure, prays for Barack to come back to Chicago every year. How does he get his mojo back? You were pretty good in talking about what he's done wrong. What does he need to do right, and will he do it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm assessing the challenges for him because I'm not exactly sure what direction he does follow back. I think somebody said to me recently, he has a choice. If he's able to listen to the country and make not just some tactical changes, but some real strategic changes as a result, then I think he's on a path toward re-election. He has to, some things have to happen in the economy. If he can make some outreach to the business community, if he can do some things, I think, to confound Republicans, make the politics harder for them, he certainly has all the potential as a leader to move the country again. But I think he's got to somehow deal with this judgment that it's not just economic anxiety, but there is a concern about the role of government in the economy that he somehow has to address. If he is perceived as a hyper-liberal who essentially wants to try to change the country and change minds to fit his vision of what the future of the economy ought to be, I think that's a more difficult path for him.
I mean, it sounds like you're almost asking him to change not just his policies, but his persona, which would be hard.
Well, maybe, but I mean, I think that he's being tested in a way that he's never been tested in his career. Okay, there was every indication on the campaign trail that he does not love politics. And there was an antipathy toward what Washington is, how Washington operates, and that's all great when you're leading a changed election. So he can either keep tapping into that and try to remove himself from Washington, but that's tough. As he said, it's difficult to sort of remove yourself from the bubble. He's got to figure that out and tap into his innate strengths as a leader. I mean, somebody said to me, look, we're going to find out what he's made of right now. He doesn't have a great deal of experience in the political arena, and the experience that he does have has, mostly been very, very successful. He faces, a more difficult path here, but there's still a path. The guy's got a lot of strengths, and Republicans who are honest about it will tell you, it's not that they're in a position of great strength, because they've got a lot of challenges themselves. So I don't think it's changing who he is, but I think it's stepping up his game in some key areas.
Fair enough. All right, we'll turn to your questions. The first one: can anybody beat Rahm? Just kidding. Do you expect the president to have a challenger in the primary, and if so, who?
I think that's an interesting question about a primary challenge. I think inside the White House they certainly don't expect it. Russ Feingold was interesting on election night when he said it's on to 2012 and the next chapter begins, and a lot of us were scratching our heads saying, that's interesting. I think you. But look, I think you have to think about a couple of things. His Afghanistan policy is one that could potentially earn him a challenge on the left. He's got a pretty disappointed base right now. And if don't ask, don't tell does not go the president's way, and I think there's every likelihood that it will not right now because I don't know if the votes are there, rescinding the ban on gays and lesbians in the military, that's going to kind of add to the sense of disappointment that the left has about this president. Again, going back to Axelrod on Sunday, I mean, the fact that you can't say that you're willing to compromise because that is a signal to the left that you're going to cave in. It shows you how significant the pressure is from the left. So I think that's potential. I think there is also the potential of an independent run. Mike Bloomberg is more, Mayor of New York is a little bit more public about flirting with that. He's done it in the past, and I think there is this concept of the revenge of the middle right now that could take shape as a real force out there, and could become a problem.
Interesting. There we go. That's the Chicago audience, so they ask Chicago questions. Should Keith Olbermann have been suspended?
How do I want to answer that? I'll do this. I'm not going to. Let me answer. I'm not going to answer it directly because I don't want to make a headline about division within NBC News. I'd like us to be able to pursue our policies and deal with internal disagreements we have and be able to do it in a way where we can do it internally. I'm not a big fan of all of this spilling out into the press. you know, there's lots of different strands of NBC News, and Keith Olbermann is a part of that, a very successful part of that. We have, you know, opinionated, passionate people in our prime time, and that's where he resides. And I do think that any organization has to figure out how to maintain its independence. And I do think that's, as an employee of NBC News, my independence is very important. I think the audience is you know, gets it in terms of, you know, that there's Meet the Press, and I do what I do, and there's Keith Olbermann, and he does what he does. You know, that the independence of even more partisan voices in our air, that independence has to be maintained. So, you know, I think that's where the suspension came from, and I think that, you know, we're going to have to continue to work through that as an organization that is a changing organization, even as a news operation. But I believe, certainly in the work that I do, that independence is critically important. And besides, you know, beyond that, I'm going to allow our leadership to grapple with these issues.
If the polls are correct, and that's a big if, that only 4% of the people care about the deficit, why is that the subject that determines elections? What's the message?
Yeah, I'm not sure what the source of that is on the polling. I can tell you the polling I've seen is that the government spending and the debt rate's a lot higher than that. Ironically, in the exit polling, 8% of those voters ranked Afghanistan as one of the more important issues, which is striking. But no, I think it's a lot higher than that. Again, I think it's the role of government, it's economic anxiety, and it's government spending. You know, I don't know that everybody. I mean, I'm not really sophisticated enough in my own financial education to understand all of the ramifications of our debt. You know, on the world stage. I mean, I try to talk to really smart people about you know, a pending bond crisis and the like, and I think there's real issues, but I think that people just sort of intuitively get that government spending without any sort of end is just not a good idea, and is not consistent with how they live their own lives.
Did the president make a mistake surrounding himself with Chicago friends, Axelrod, Emanuel Jarrett, and not people who were not so closely tied to him?
You know, I think it's an important part of leadership that you surround yourself with people that you trust. I think that matters. I think Bush did that. I think Obama has done that. But you've got to have people who are going to challenge you. And I just don't know the extent to which that has gone on, and the extent to which people have pushed him to break out of his comfort zone in areas that matter, whether it's in relationships with the press, in relationships on Capitol Hill, and the ability to keep connecting with the American people. I do think it is, you know, it's malpractice if you have political advisors after the campaign that they ran 2 years later for the president to say, I'm you know, struggling connecting with the American people. He has been let down in some way, and perhaps, you know, he's to blame for that. But, you know, I think people who are close, and certainly, you know, I think Rahm Emanuel being from Chicago was not the big issue. He had the kind of relationships on the Hill that could really help him, and was certainly a tough enough guy to be chief of staff. But, you know, results matter. So they may have been successful legislatively, and they may have accomplished a lot on paper. It's just ironic to me that Bill Clinton, you know, takes such a hard hit in '94 for failing to get health care, and Barack Obama takes such a hit in 2010 for succeeding on health care. I mean, it's a little bit ironic, but it says something about, again, this role of government. So these advisors do need to try to shake Obama up in a way to put into place some kind of course correction, and whatever that means in terms of how he interacts with the public and with the press and with members of Congress. Something needs to be done, because I mean, just take, you know, members of Congress. I mean, not meeting with Republican leaders is just probably not a great idea. It wasn't a great idea when you know, I think Bush really didn't do it either, and he found early on that he couldn't move some of these people, and that, you know, the relationships were just sort of toxic early on. You know, that's not helpful. I mean, one of the things that I think is sad about Washington, having covered it, you know, when Ted Kennedy died, I mean, you know, much of his career was before my time, but as a student of history and in my own reporting, to get a glimpse, as I did that weekend of his funeral, to how Washington operated, how the Senate operated. It is a mistake if in the rest of the country we look at Washington and say, oh, well, you know, the art of compromise or the art of legislating is somehow dirty work or is dishonorable work. It's got to happen, or else what you're going to have is the only thing that gets celebrated in Washington is saying no to people. And that's not really what the point of it all is. So they've really got to work through that. That's a little bit of a tangent, but I thought it was relevant.
No, it is. A personal question. Which of the guests you've had on your show has been the most difficult, and why?
Oh, this is tempting. I wish Rahm Emanuel would have come on the program more than just once. But he apparently wasn't a big fan. You know, I thought he was plenty good on the program. I think that the challenge that I face, I'll give you sort of various levels of it. You know, when you interview the Clintons, it's always a challenge from this point of view. And I really enjoyed the interview. I did an hour-long interview with Secretary Clinton because I thought we had the time to really explore politics with some step back and also her view of the world. But both she and the former president are so expert at interviews that you can ask a question and you'll never get it back. You end up chasing the question around. Can I get an answer to that, please? Or can I? And there's no easy way to interrupt, not gracefully anyway. So they're very skilled in that stuff. Look, I think the overarching thing that I think about, I try to really focus on listening and to getting to something real. And you have to sort of get through a lot of muck to do that and to really try to pin people down. And and a lot of times they're not going to be pinned down, and it's just kind of how they operate. But I think that's the difficulty, is trying to get them off of what they've come to the program to say, to try to give us something a little more genuine.
So you're not going to give in to temptation here?
Yeah, no, I mean, I gave you the one Rahm example where he and I didn't see eye to eye on his appearance, but that's all.
I'm just shocked at the notion that politicians in Washington are like politicians in Chicago. They don't answer reported questions. Can't believe it. Illinois is traditionally a free trade state. We have a lot of big exporters here. Bill Daley over there could certainly tell you something about it. But yet, in much of the Democratic Party now, trade has become a very toxic issue with union folks. Now you have a bunch of Tea Party Republicans coming in. You would think normally that Republicans, they're for trade, they're for business, they're for it. How does that play out with the Tea Party people? Are we going to get anywhere with the pending deals with South Korea and whatever, or is this whole thing just in deep freeze?
It's a good question, and I don't have a totally satisfactory answer other than, again, this is going to be another test of not only the president sort of standing up to unions, but also the Republicans somehow navigating the Tea Party strain that's not for trade. And I think, it just becomes a kind of a curious part of the future of the economy. There has to be some focus on what America's role in the world and American competitiveness really means. This is a bigger question in terms of where we're going in our education system, our public education system, where we're going with trade, and how we're going to compete with countries like India and China. And I think one of the big questions, kind of to your point, is going to be whether we have a political system in the country that is worthy of the challenges we face. And again, I think that's some level of frustration that Americans were emphasizing at the polls.
The next question kind of plays into that. The Washington Post recently ran an editorial suggesting the president choose not to seek re-election so that he could concentrate on governance, really changing the system rather than campaigning. Do you think there's any possibility of that occurring? No, but I mean, again, based on my own reporting, I do think this president has a certain measure of fatalism about his political future. This is how it was described to me. I mean, here was somebody who spent so little time as a state legislator and then in the Senate and becomes president of the United States, the first African-American president. This is not somebody who thinks that, the small tactical changes one makes politically amount to a whole lot. If there are big forces that sweep him out of office, I get a sense that there's a certain peace about that, maybe even more than another president's. Now, having said that, I think he's going to run for re-election, and I don't. I don't think we'll see. It almost becomes a gimmick. I remember with McCain, the idea what he promised to just run for one term so he could really focus on getting things done. I mean, we have a political system that is about one's reelection, that is about the accountability of standing for reelection, and really trying to make some change within that. Again, I think the great challenge here is to figure out what is the appropriate amount of movement of the government that the American people will accept. I mean, there's something going on here. If you go back to 2006, look at 2008 and 2010, where we have these huge swings in the electorate in terms of independent voters moving en masse, lurching back and forth. There's something going on. The notion we were talking about at the table of even in a place where machine politics used to mean something, where you have less faith in an institution like government to guide voting patterns. This is a period of economic and political upheaval against a backdrop of real deep-seated questions about America's role in the world. Both our security in the world, our role in the world militarily, but also our competitiveness. So these are big-time problems, and I think that there is both pessimism and just anxiety about how, as a country, we navigate this. One thing I think we see with some clarity is that there is some antipathy to moving too dramatically in one direction or another to respond to these problems.
To follow up on that, if the public seems to want change, they certainly go back and forth, and President Obama not running again is not the way it's going to occur. How do we get this fundamental change to make the system work rather than just tinker around the margins in elections that don't mean anything?
Well, I mean, I think these elections do mean something because you have this sorting out period. There's a sorting out period going on in the Republican Party right now. And as I say, I mean, I at least at this moment maintain a level of optimism that, that both sides here in Washington have enough vested interest and have heard the voters enough to try to get some things done here, as opposed to just staying on kind of an ideological battleground to just move toward 2012. We've seen in the recent past that government can accomplish some really big things, even if they're polarizing things. So you just don't want everything to have to be precipitated by some kind of crisis before you get some sort of action. I do think there's got to be a leveling off of extremism on both sides to get some things done that government can actually accomplish. And I do think the debt is an area where you can find some potential consensus. That you're going to have some courage to make some of these choices. But I think that we're beginning to see, certainly in this election, and we'll see more of it, I think, by 2012, enough of an imperative that the voters are saying, look, if you want any measure of trust from us, or if you want us to vote that have any faith in you, you've got to actually achieve something. Is saying no or running in this particular direction is not enough.
Closing the debt is the next question. We just had a fascinating election for governor here in Illinois, where one candidate said that he was going to close a $13 billion hole, but wouldn't tell you how he's going to do it. The other guy said he was going to raise taxes. He was going to use the taxes to pay for new spending, not to fill the $13 billion hole. Big chunks of the federal budget are effectively offline or extraordinarily unpopular. Social Security, defense, Medicare. If you're really going to whack at it and get somewhere, what do you really cut?
Yeah. Well, I think you got to deal with entitlement spending. I think Social Security, Medicare. I think some of the more draconian areas have to do with, say, the prescription drug benefit under Medicare, which some conservatives are talking about taking a shot at. I don't know. It's a very difficult benefit to try to take away. I think there is defense spending that might be looked at, but you've got to stare down the barrel of some of the very difficult choices. I mean, I don't understand why we can't seem to have an honest discussion in this country about the future of Social Security and raising the retirement age or means testing when there just is a viability question of these programs being sustained over time, and so many people I talk to, certainly people of my generation, don't expect Social Security to be there in the same way that it's there now. So you're going to have to take a whack at these programs. Now again here, I think there's something to the Debt Commission that's important, which is rather than doing it piecemeal and making individual painful choices, I think you have to to introduce the notion of shared sacrifice. I mean, look at some of the, a very hot figure right now in the political landscape is Chris Christie, the governor of New Jersey, who, is making some real headway in sort of talking straight to people and also really cutting his budget. Now, there may be a price to pay for that going forward, but there's an element of the conversation that I think is very attractive to people, which is, hey guys, we got to get real here. We just can't continue on this path. Everybody's going to have to sacrifice here if we're going to do this. I think watching him will be interesting if there's a political upside for him to continue to do that. Maybe there's a model there for Republicans and Democrats to get together, but I think it does have to be programmatic and systemic, where they say, here's a big approach to making some headway here. And I think, it's like on health care. I mean, I think Rahm Emanuel and others had suggested, look, we could do some things in a more piecemeal approach to dealing with the health care law that might be more doable, maybe bring on some Republican support, and that's a better way to move forward. So it's not about, if the choice is being a transformational leader and being an incrementalist, that may be a false choice. I think that government has to be able to move on some of these issues in a way that builds some credibility out there in the country.
I'm not sure I agree with the premise of this one, but it's an interesting question given what you said about where you're trying to position your show. Why has the political left failed to construct a viable answer to right-wing radio, Fox News Channel?
Well, I think it's an interesting question. I mean, the left has not been very organized in this country. I mean, I could track this when I was covering the White House. It was not until 2005 that the left really sort of organized in opposition to the war. I never thought Bush would lose in 2004 on the WMD issue. I mean, granted it came close, but I never thought he would really be held accountable for that because there was too much disagreement on the left. I think the left has certainly done a lot, but look, I mean, I think that I think the country is still a more conservative country. You have some really prominent voices on the left, but I just think it tends to be a lot more disparate on the left, and it makes it more difficult, certainly in the media context, to consolidate around one sort of operating idea. And from a media perspective, as opposed to what Fox News has done, which has really not captured all the various strains on the right, but has been pretty consistent in its voice.
Two more questions here. What do you think of instituting a question time where the President appears in the well of the House to answer questions from members of Congress, similar to the practice in the United Kingdom, where the Prime Minister answers questions in Parliament?
I think it'd be fantastic. I'm a big fan of question and answer time. I think it's a great idea. I mean, look, the president had some success. Remember the very positive feedback he got when he went to that Republican conference meeting in Maryland and he took on some of these questions? I mean, we have a president who has the intellectual rigor to take the tough question and think in your presence and to openly debate these issues. He can handle it. I think there was some downside when he convened that health care meeting for the cameras that was bipartisan, where I think part of the problem he ran into on health care is that you really don't, as your president, you don't really want to dirty your hands getting involved with legislation, and I thought he had to get a little too involved at some point, and maybe that represented that. But I think the notion of going out there and taking on the opposition, I don't understand some of their media choices in terms of not going on media that they consider to be hostile to them. For fear of what? I mean, this guy can take it. He can debate with anybody, and yet, and they've made some of those choices. So I think that'd be a fantastic idea. Anything that forces, I just wish there'd be a little bit more, intellectual spontaneity, on both sides of the aisle, where you can have politicians who would say, we disagree about a lot of things, but so-and-so has a really decent idea, over from the other party on how to deal with this issue, and maybe we can try to work with each other. But this is where we all have to take the rap here too, as the voters of the country. If we're going to penalize people for doing that, then we get what we get. And this is a problem with the grassroots. It's a problem with our political advertising, but that cannot be the basis for being voted out of office, if you somehow accommodate the other side.
Let's see if we can get one final story out of you here.
Okay.
George Bush gave you two nicknames, Stretch and the Dancer. I get the first.
Yeah.
How about the second? Well,
that nickname was not, I mean, that wasn't a wide thing. We did this thing at the correspondence dinner where, in a memorably low moment, they had this entertainment and they pulled up, they were picking on NBC. So Fox News was behind this, okay? This is a setup. You know, Fox is, as you may have seen, has something of a war against NBC for reasons that they maybe know. So they set up this thing to pick on all this NBC. So a producer I work with and I was pulled up, and then they bring up Karl Rove, and they're doing some kind of rap thing. And I just, at the moment, I made a decision. I'm either going to sort of play along here, or you know, I'm going to you know, be very self-righteous about it and say I'm not going to participate in all of this. And when I heard it was some kind of rap routine, I thought it was really going to be awful. And then I realized that he was the one who was going to be doing the rapping, and I thought, okay, I can be the backup dancer here, and that'll be painless enough. It's certainly not a moment that I was happy to have been part of, because I do think a lot of people look at that and go, okay, this is the problem with Washington, all this coziness. I don't think it really impacted the tough questions I was asking. But the only thing I got out of that moment is that it was featured in the finale of The Sopranos, so you know, so it wasn't all bad. But the whole, you know, the whole nickname thing was actually interesting with Bush, because, you know, there was a time he had been at the ranch and he came back and there were two other reporters in the room with me and they were taller than I was, and so he said, "Gregory, I'm gonna call you Little Stretch." And this other guy, it was Super Stretch. And I thought, you know, wow, where does he get these? But I thought, you know, why couldn't we have just been like Tall, Grande, and Venti or something, you know? But he was quite focused on it, and but he did that. You know, this kind of goes back to press relations. I was talking about President Obama. You know, Bush didn't really like the press. He certainly didn't like him as much as Cheney did. But I went with Cheney to Afghanistan, and they were flying. We get to Bagram Air Base, and they were going into Kabul on the Black Hawk. And I said, well, that's fine. You know, if we're going to go with the vice president, that should be fine. They said, no, he's sending you ahead first. But you know, but Bush understood sort of intuitively that, you know, you got to forge some individual relationships with these reporters who cover you. So he'd have nicknames for those of us in a way to try to be disarming. And but then if he didn't have a nickname for you, it was so awkward, because somebody would walk in, you'd be in a pool spray situation, and he'd look out and he'd say, "Okay, question time, AP man." You know, it's always very awkward. So there you go.
Thank you for being a good sport.
One last round of applause for David Gregory. David and Greg, thank you very much. A final thank you to our sponsor, J.P. Morgan Chase, and to all of you for attending. Stay tuned to the Cranes and City Club website for information on our next Public Affairs Forum. Thank you again, and have a wonderful day.